Yeah, I think it's important to point out that there isn't just like a cultural like continuation of um a cultural continuation of the Indian Wars, but it's actually grounded in like real examples in terms of creating and using legal mechanisms that justified the killing of indigenous people to torture Afghanis or people who were considered quote unquote terrorists. And as some examples, we can look at the John C. Yu torture memos, who, you know, he was a UC law professor. He was also the U.S. Attorney General for the Justice Department. But he's cited as precedent for torture the 1873 Supreme Court decision on Modoc prisoners, basically saying that because they're not entirely like state combatants, they're not recognized as state combatants, they don't technically have rights. So this was in the memo that was used by the Bush administration to essentially to create a legal justification for torture and to forever detain detainees at Guantanamo. And so it's not just like some kind of like offhand thing, but I think it's also important to remember that the cultural phenomenon of Indian killing plays a very prominent role in how the United States sees itself as a kind of civilizing influence throughout the world. And some sort of like cultural examples of that, I think one of the things that I've noticed like in like rewatching, because there's all these like, you know, 9/11 memorials, you know, documentaries. I've watched like 3 of them. I've watched like 3 of them, just tortured myself watching them. But one thing they never talk about is the immense amount of scapegoating of Arab people and Muslims in the United States and throughout the world. And like that kind of climate of like racial terror that they created, you know, attacking like, you know, we went up to line 3 and one of our good buddies, Phil, is an older Navajo gentleman. He was working at a deli. I think he was a baker at a deli, and there were a lot of Iraqi workers there, and people would just come in and like physically assault them. Like, you know, they you know, attack them. I think one of them was in a hijab, and they tried to pull the hijab off. So it's like, it's how we remember that kind of like that time period is really fascinating, because the United States has selective memory, just the way that they have selective memory around the Indian Wars as not being the longest war. They don't even remember. It's not even remembered, even though on the you know, the U.S. Army flag, they have battle streamers, and it shows that the longest campaign, you know, the most campaigns in the longest time period was a section called the Indian Wars, which has 14 battle streamers on it, beginning in 1791 and ending in 1891. Because they counted the Wounded Knee Massacre as a battle, as a campaign, as a military campaign, which formally ended with the troops leaving the reservation in 1891. Even though that was like a quote-unquote domestic insurgency, right? They were deploying the U.S. military against them. And, you know, before we kind of get into other stuff, I just want to make some other points, like the whole thing about, you know, Osama bin Laden wanted, dead or alive, you know, but also the idea of the Indian hunt, right? And the hunt for terrorists, that whole thing, not just for Obama, but for other people. Like just the rounding up of random people who they felt like they were considered terrorists. There was Al Jazeera reporters who were rounded up in this and terrorized and tortured. So that like the quote unquote red Indian metaphor captures perfectly the combat challenge for the 21st century, meaning that the enemies of the United States are everywhere and nowhere at the same time, right? They can just literally be manifested. And this is ingrained in how the United States projects its power, not only on this continent, but through the world. In the 1776 Declaration of Independence, it calls the inhabitants on our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose only known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all sexes, ages, and conditions, meaning that we don't discriminate about who we kill, but the reality is that they don't discriminate about who they kill. And sort of lastly, thinking about that kind of cultural aspect, counterinsurgency doctrine in the United States, like when officers go to the Naval Academy, or when they go to like West Point, one of the first things they study in counterinsurgency tactics, or the first thing is they study in counterinsurgency tactics, is the U.S. Indian Wars, going up into the boarding school era, and they see the boarding school as actually as a counterinsurgency program and a policy, not just of domestic kind of Indian policy, because the first boarding schools in the United States were run by military officers. And so I think that's incredibly important that that this kind of projection of U.S. power throughout the world, the U.S. didn't become an empire after 1891. It was always an empire. It was born an empire. It was born an empire to kill Indians and to take land and to get resources. And so all those officers who fought in the Indian Wars, a lot of them are Civil War veterans, and some of them went as Indian War veterans they were sent over to the Philippines or to Cuba or to Nicaragua to invade these other countries, right? And this is really what we see as kind of a long war. It's the U.S. long war. It's not really so much a unique war, and because it never really ended. The United States, I haven't found, and I was talking to Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz about this in a recent interview, we haven't found a single day in U.S. history where the United States hasn't been at war, right? And so I think that's important to remember.